Okay, Matt, thank you for joining us, and thank you for writing your book, as they say. So just a bit of context for the room. I think the last time Matt and I discussed political theory was roughly 2011 in the University Arms in Sheffield, when I was but a PhD student and he was proper faculty. And I remember, you may not remember this, I remember we were having a proper row over something. God knows what it was. And I remember having this, but I think this, and you said, I think this, and we slowly worked it down to some sort of base level going, well, there we go. We disagree. It was, whatever it was, there was some moment where we hit the sort of ontological base, and then we just kept drinking. And I really appreciated that. So taking us back to 2011, I was reading this, I was interested in how did you get into this? And I was wondering, your previous work, as Sophie has talked about, was around the idea of liberal realism or realistic liberalism. How did you come to post-liberalism? Before you explain what it is, or maybe obliquely into that.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say thank you to the IPR for the invitation to this event and for the interest in the book. I do really, genuinely, greatly appreciate it. I mean, in terms of how did I come to post-liberalism, the answer to that, I guess, is that like many people, I mean, I don't claim any great clairvoyance, I thought it was pretty obvious that the Conservative Party were heading towards electoral disaster in the previous general 2024 general election. And so I got that bit right. But what I assumed is that would then result in a long period, generation where they'll be out of power and they'll have to go through a period of ideological reflection and renewal. And so I was interested, therefore, in the different sort of strands at the time of the so-called new right, which is sort of the umbrella term that's often used for the various different, there are many now actually, different sort of ideological movements on the right, post-liberalism being one of them. Of course, this hadn't happened for various reasons, Conservative Party, because of reform and because of how Labour have done, I think. They haven't had that opportunity of ideological reflection after all. But my general interest in the ideological sort of foundations or intellectual foundations of the political right is what led me to post-liberalism. As to the connection between the post-liberalism and realism, that I genuinely don't know. In fact, someone is kindly writing a review of the book. Professor LSE is writing a review of the book in which he's going to connect it to my work on realism. So I'm actually looking forward to finding out what the connection is between the two. And I guess at a very broad level, I mean, part of how I approach political theory is via a question of what's possible historically, socially, given the context of modernity and so on and so forth. Some are slightly averse to utopianism or dystopianism, you might think, in the case of post-liberalism. And that part of my analysis of post-liberalism takes that sort of form and that sort of critique. But substantially, I'm not quite clear what the link is between realism and liberalism, quite frankly.
Okay.
I should do, shouldn't I? Really?
Not at all, not at all. So let's move on to post-liberalism. I've got two quotes in the book which are the most simplistic outlines, and I'm going to ask you to flesh them out so I can stop talking. One, a rejection of liberalism in all its forms, understood as a philosophy committed to the maximization of individual freedom, directly and wholly responsible for all the major issues and grievances in Western liberal societies. And two, an alternative political vision that gives primacy to the common good, where that justifies a politics, which I'll let you outline. So that we've got that rejection of liberalism in all forms, primacy to the common good, and then elsewhere you essentially say right on culture, left on economics.
Yeah.
What do we need to flesh that out?
Yeah, so, the two, I think the best way of understanding is that first definition, really. There are some people who define post-liberalism really broadly. So there's a sort of another book that's come out about the same time, published also by Polity, on post-liberalism, which if you're interested in post-liberalism and the left, I particularly recommend you read. It's by Paul Kelly, called Against Post-Liberalism. And he has a very broad interpretation of post-liberalism that would include people like Matt Goodwin, David Goodhart, Nick Timothy, right through to some of the people that I talk about. But I have a much narrower definition of post-liberalism, because I think what's unique about post-liberalism is important and shouldn't be shouldn't be lost. I think it's worth starting talking about post-liberalism by recognizing that when I started writing this, or interested in these ideas, so some, I don't know, five or so years ago, whatever it was, it really, the post-liberals really were just a bunch of well-tenured but eccentric online cranks. So we're talking here about people like Patrick Deneen, who's Professor of Political Theory at Notre Dame, Adrian Vermeule, who's Professor of Constitutional Theory at Harvard. They're the two main post-liberals in the American context. And they were tapping away on Twitter, and they had this Substack, and they weren't making any political waves. And so my ever supportive colleagues at Sheffield, when I said, "Oh, what are you working on?" "I'm working on post-liberals," they would say, "Well, why and how are you wasting your time on these people?" Fast forward a few years, and we are now in a position where we are literally one overzealous golf swing away, or one Big Mac too many, of having a post-liberal in the White House. So Vice-President JD Vance calls himself of the post-liberal right, and is friends with a lot of the people that I write about here, and shouldn't overstate how ideologically coherent his worldview is. It's made up of all different sort of, tech broism and all that, and lots of other things. But he is deeply influenced by post-liberalism. So it's a wonderful example of the importance of political ideas and of political theory. That if you say, "Oh, why do these ideas matter?" No one believes in them. Well, that was true of post-liberalism 5 years away, but it really is stalking the corridors of power right now.
And what is it?
And what is it? So it is, two things I think is how to define it. One is that it's rejection of liberalism. Right? It rejects liberalism in all its forms. So it thinks, on the one hand, you've got that classical liberalism that sort of emphasizes economic freedoms and individual freedoms. Sort of classical liberalism they associate with people like Locke, Adam Smith, Hayek, and so on. And then more recently, you've got progressive liberalism, or identity politics, and woke, and so on. They think that they're just variations of a theme, and that theme being the maximization of individual freedom. And they think that liberalism, as a philosophy, which started with Thomas Hobbes and Francis Bacon, apparently, has always been committed to the maximization of individual freedom. That's, for them, the really important commitment of liberalism. And with that, you get all the sorts of normal associated ideas conservatives packaged together with liberalism: rights before duties, individualism, social contract, and so on. Now, they think that, and I'm not exaggerating here, that literally every problem in the West today, environmental, economic, social, political, spiritual, is the fault of this liberalism. And the history of the last 500 or so years literally is the history of this idea sort of unfolding itself throughout Western societies. And so they say, look around you. Right? This is the world liberalism built, and this is you should hate it for that. You should want some alternative. So the most famous post-liberal book is probably by Patrick Deneen, called Why Liberalism Failed. Not did liberalism fail, why liberalism failed. And the point is, it failed because it succeeded, because it got into power and put its ideas into practice, because those ideas were false in a variety of different ways. It's led to all the problems we now have. So it's a wholehearted rejection of liberalism, hence the post in post-liberalism. And I think it is worth also distinguishing here between post-liberals, because there are the American post-liberals, who I focus on, who really vehemently hate liberalism and want a completely non-liberal alternative. And then you have these wonderful British, much more moderate post-liberals. People like John Milbank, a theologian at Notre Dame, Adrian Pabst, if you read New Statesman or anything like that, you probably know his name. Those two were heavily influential in Blue Labour, the rise of the Blue Labour movement. Then another British post-liberal is someone called Philip Blond, who you might also have heard of, who's more influential on the right. The point is, they are much more centrist. They are not against liberalism. Really, they think they're just sort of correcting liberalism, or the excesses of liberalism. The post-liberals I'm interested in really mean it when they say they are post-liberal, okay? So, yeah, one is the complete rejection of liberalism. So that then raises the question, what is the alternative they want to put in its place? And where liberalism, they think, is defined by this commitment to maximising individual freedom, they want to replace it with a politics centred around a notion of the common good. Now, post-liberals, in truth, disagree amongst themselves about how to conceptualise the common good, and in truth, they don't say enough about it. So it's actually very hard to say what they mean by the common good. But I think this politics has at least four features that I'll quickly just reel off. One is that it's perfectionist, which is to say, this is a sort of lingo from political theory, really, but this is the idea that whereas liberalism says it should be neutral and not take a position on moral questions or ideas of the good life, how you should live, and all those sorts of things, post-liberals say, no, politics should be interested in guiding people towards living well, right? It should take a stand on moral questions. It's also a heavily statist vision of politics. The state is to use its power in order to help guide people towards the truth, towards the good. It's a confessional politics. So the American post-liberals are all Catholic. And if you ask, well, what is the content of the common good? What is it to live well? They either sort of slightly dodge the question, or when they're writing for online Catholic, like the Josias magazine, and they'll be more honest and say, yes, it's Catholicism. That's what we mean when we talk about the common good. So it's a confessional politics, and it's also an elitist politics. That's to say, they agree in a sense with the populist diagnosis that the liberal elite became too out of touch with the common people, so to speak, but they want to just replace the elite with a better elite, i.e. a post-liberal elite, people like them. And they have different strategies for how they should do that, and we can talk about that maybe. But they are, unabashedly elitist in their theory. That'll do, I think. Yeah,
you wiped out 2 or 3 of my questions.
Done,
so
right.
Thanks for that.
Let's go for dinner.
No, absolutely. There's so much I could unpack in this here. One of the things which is quite interesting, of the many interesting things within the work, you talked about it there, the Catholicism, integralism, etc. I was wondering, how is it that one can almost have a Catholicism which is almost against the Pope? There is one nice quote you had in here, which is a quote from, you had many nice quotes, forgive me every time I say that, Amari, where he says, well, if the Roman pontiff isn't running around demanding confessional states in the 21st century, then a lay Catholic writer such as yours truly would be wise simultaneously to demur, which I thought was a lovely quote. But you then have a bunch of other people here going, no, the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, totally wrong. The Pope's clearly a liberal. Yeah. It seems interesting that you can have Catholicism minus the Pope's role.
Well, of course, the Pope can't be wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
it's infallibility.
Just as an aside, Sohrab Ahmari might be someone else, another name you might be familiar with if you read things like The New Statesman. He's had quite a journey as one of the sort of the young Turks of the post-liberals, one of them really most strident and vicious in many ways, and has now become very mainstream. He's dropped the post-liberalism and now finds he can write for lots of mainstream media, including Unheard and The New Statesman and so on. But yeah, he's dropped the post-liberalism, and so that quote is from an essay where he sort of is attacking his previous comrades. The important thing about integralism, I think, is one that not all post-liberals are integralists. Integralists are people who are they're a little, almost a little sect of Catholicism, who basically think Vatican II was a big mistake, right? So dignitatis humanae, the idea that Catholicism sort of reconciles itself to liberal, pluralistic societies, and can now accept religious toleration. That was a terrible mistake, according to integralist post-liberals like Vermeulen. And we need to return to pre-Vatican II Catholicism, where the Church has authority over the state and can, in certain circumstances, use the state's power to realise our spiritual ends, right? So it's pretty scary, well, from my point of view, pretty scary stuff, and the closest we've got to a fleshed-out political theory of integralism makes it clear that non-believers wouldn't have rights, women wouldn't be able to vote unless their husband, the head of the household, died, adulterers would lose their rights, and so on and so forth. Right? It's a really deeply unequal, unegalitarian, intolerant sort of vision they have here. Now, what to do about the Pope? Well, their answer is that they think we basically misinterpreted Dignitatis Humanae. We've just been getting it wrong for a long time. And in fact, the lead thinker in this is a philosopher at KCL, someone called Thomas Pink. And I was speaking to a friend there who's a philosopher there as well. So I've been reading some of your colleagues' work. Thomas Pink is all the stuff on Hobbes. He's famous for being a Thomas Hobbes scholar. I said, no, the stuff about Dignitatis Humanae. He had no idea that he had this sort of side career as an advocate of this sort of Catholicism. But that's where it's come from. And the idea is, as I say, that we've misinterpreted. I won't go into details, the sort of theological nature of the theological reinterpretation. But it's not that the Pope is wrong. It's that we just misinterpreted what Dignitatis Humanae was actually saying.
You've said in several parts there. So first of all, you've got a small amount of sort of a minority within a minority of Catholic thinkers here. You've talked about how you've kind of narrowed it down from Patrick and Adrian here, out of a long list of people here. You've also talked about the fact that some of their ideas aren't clear, and I think that's a really important thing to come through to hear, some of their language. Is there a risk that you're making post-liberalism too coherent?
I doubt it.
Okay. But on that sort of the coherency, I think a really insightful point you make here is almost, shall we say, there's a slightly bad faith element to some of these post-liberal theories here. And one of the risks and failures of liberalism is that they keep engaging with them like political theorists. Yeah. They keep trying to point to, well, there's an underlying tension within your political theory, you see. Do you not see here? Rather than understanding that this is a politicized debate. There's a wonderful quote, again, from Ninin, where he says he dubs his strategy Machiavellian means to achieve Aristotelian ends. And with that in mind, again, when I say you're treating these ideas with the respect they deserve, I believe. But could you say more about the fact that those ideas are maybe not always on face value? Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, actually. I think we do treat, and I think we here, I think, as liberals, maybe generally, not necessarily just liberal theorists, but we do treat our opponents as if they are sort of, as if it was me and you in the University Arms in 2011 having a high-fluting intellectual conversation. Unbelievable.
No, well, not that, But nevertheless, the idea that the nature of our disagreements are essentially intellectual in some way, and that therefore, in order to really get post-liberals, to really, really sort of skewer them, what you really need to do is show that their arguments are incoherent or inconsistent, or they get liberalism wrong, and they do get liberalism wrong. I mean, I find it hard to even sort of describe their account of liberalism with a straight face, because if there are any undergraduate politics students here who have done, do you teach all the history of political theory here? So taught Locke or John Stuart Mill. I mean, you will know by reading the post-liberals that they just get it flat wrong. So the idea, for example, that Locke thought the point of politics was to maximise individual freedom, or Hobbes thought the point of politics was to maximise individual freedom, right? Completely ludicrous. I mean, politics 101 stuff. So, and there's a mini industry, I guess, in which maybe I've played my own little part of showing this. And post-liberals never really respond. And so you sort of have to think to yourself, well, why are they not responding? And I think the answer to that, and I'm actually writing something about this now, is that we're failing to really see that what they're doing is politics. And we're doing philosophy or theory. And so they don't really care very much if their account of liberalism is truthful. It doesn't matter. The question for them, and I think the question for us, the better question for us, is not do they get liberalism right, for instance, but why are they defining liberalism in that way? And the reason why they define liberalism in that way is because they want it to be able to include everything in liberal politics, so the only alternatives are to accept liberal politics or to reject it. But if liberalism is responsible for everything that's bad in modern society, well, you'd want to reject it, right? So it's about them constraining the political choices into a binary. And so in a certain sense, yeah, we're playing their game.
Yeah, you have a wonderful line here where you talk about how essentially they deliberately argue at sort of the philosophical level about liberalism, which forces liberals to then argue at the philosophical level about sort of metaphysics. And your argument is liberals need to remember liberalism is a political movement. Yeah,
and I'm not very good at remembering that, but I do think that is absolutely right. They're just playing a different sort of game. They're trying to get power. Liberal philosophers pointing out they've got these things wrong, it's just not really getting to the point, I don't think.
How much do you buy that we should be scared when we have Deneen, etc., talking about sort of coup d'etats and then sort of backtracking that he didn't mean it quite like that after January 6th?
Yeah. Well, I don't think so. So when I said earlier that it's an elitist politics and they have different strategies for how they get their elites in power, there are two strategies really. One, Patrick Deneen, and another, Adrian Venules. Patrick Deneen, who is good friends with JD Vance, basically thinks the post-liberals need to do a Trump and take over the Republican Party and then win power. And once you've done that, you can remake power. You can remake America along post-liberal lines. So he hates Trump. He refuses to even use his name, actually. But he likes his methods and just thinks post-liberals should do the same. Now, how scared should we be of that? Well, given how small the Catholic constituency is in America, I don't think we should be too worried about that. And especially not just how small the Catholic constituency is, those sorts of Catholics as well. Adrian Vemule's strategy, I think we should be very worried about because I think it is working. So he has a strategy which he calls integration from within. And by integration, he means integralism, right? And his idea is that you should get people with the right values into positions within the administrative executive state. So not elected to Senate, not anything like that, but they should basically take over the bureaucracy because that's where real power lies, he thinks. And once they're in these positions, they can then use their power completely unaccountable. They use their power to shift things in more post-liberal directions and make a post-liberal society possible. Now, the reason why I think that's scary is because, in a certain sense, that's what has been happening with the Trump administration. The Claremont Institute, the right in America have been phenomenal at training, vetting, and putting their people in positions of power in ways that mean it's quite unlikely that even if Trump leaves, or when Trump leaves, hopefully, that agenda will continue. And that's where the real power lies. So that general strategy, I think we should be very scared about.
The long, slow march through the institutions, but from the right.
That's right. Yeah.
So at the heart of this central thing is this idea. Well, there's two elements here. In your first description of post-liberalism, you went for the first element, the anti-liberalism and the common good. I was wondering if you could say more then on how that latches onto what you see as right on culture, which is around the common good to some extent, but the right on culture to an extent covers those two elements, but also left on economics. There's a list here of these post-liberal values in here at one point, which the socialist in me got, oh, absolutely, this sounds absolutely wonderful. What a great idea. What have we got? Breaking up monopolistic corporations to pursue short-term projects, call for rebuilding domestic manufacturing, securing vital supply chains. God, can you imagine that today, supply chains? But what have we got? Strengthening trade unions, family wages. Sounds great. How does this fit together with the sort of that anti-liberalism in a right culture with this left economics?
Well, because they think all of the things like the rise of tech monopolies, they blame on the individualism of liberal culture.
Mm-hmm.
2008 was the fault of liberal philosophy and everything. So all of those, I mean, I should say it was difficult for me to say much more than that list because they don't say much more about their political economy. And I think actually it's one of the real weaknesses of post-liberalism is they really don't say anything about their political economy. But the idea, it's a familiar sort of series of laments about how capitalism has gutted communities of offshoring and all those sorts of things, and it hasn't, wages have been stagnant and so on and so forth. And the politics of the common good would somehow create an economy that is geared towards the working class as well. I mean, it's one thing to say about post-liberalism, and I think actually one way in which I do welcome it, I don't think I actually say this in the book, but it does reintroduce class politics. So I imagine you'll be amenable too, because they do think in terms of classes. And so they keep talking about how post-liberalism would serve the common man much more than liberal philosophy would.
Although their elites wouldn't be drawn from the working class, one feels.
No. But Deneen has this really quite. I mean, it's silly. I mean, it is silly. I mean, I do actually think, in a certain sense, Deneen is just silly. He thinks the working classes. This is an old classical view, I guess. The old working classes are virtuous, pure. They have common sense. They know what the common good is. It's the elites who are committed to liberal values, imposing that upon them. And so for him, post-liberalism really is just sort of getting the elites to be able to do what the working class already want. Mm-hmm. Now, I think he's completely wrong about that. And one of the reasons why I think, again, Vermeule's post-liberalism is genuinely scary and dangerous is that Vermeule, at least to his credit, knows that people are not committed to post-liberalism. He knows Americans are committed to pluralism and so on. But he doesn't see that as a problem at all. In fact, you just get power. Once you've got power, you can change people's beliefs. It's a transformative project in that sense. And he does genuinely say that after this transition period has been complete, and he never doubts that it would be successful, right? That people would come to thank the post-liberals for having led them to true beliefs. So in that case, it is a more top-down project. But again, not the elites, not coming from the working classes. It's probably coming from the people that Vermeule and Deneen are teaching at Harvard and at Notre Dame.
You've mentioned the positive there of sort of the reintegration of class politics. Another thing, because one of the questions is why read this excellent and highly affordable book is.
It's his main virtue.
If it's exactly, you're not just telling a story here about look at these people with ideas which I can demonstrably say are incoherent and they're arguing in bad faith. There is an important reason for this. One, it is so that people can be aware maybe, so they can think about how to counter it.
Yeah.
But you also see some positives, maybe not necessarily positives from the ideology, but the positives it raises. And you say, rediscovering the moral promise of liberalism is the route to its survival. You talk about this raising of the concept of the common good, again, the moral purpose, is something that actually liberalism needs to engage with. I can point you to... I'd just be interested, before I start talking about social liberalism or new liberalism, I'd be interested, tell me more. In fact, I wrote down here, rediscovering the moral promise of liberalism is the route to its survival. Discuss. Like, that is a perfect essay question.
I'm not sure I'll do very well on that essay. So, I don't know if I say that as a commitment, my own commitment.
All right, fine, I'll quote you.
No, but
just to prove it.
Oh, okay. Sleat versus Sleat.
Sleat versus Sleat. Reintroducing the possibility of a politics centred on the common good, then, is in many respects the greatest service that post-liberalism has done the right.
Okay. So I'm thinking, so there I'm talking specifically about the right.
Insofar as the book is, I'm interrupting you again, but I got the floor. Insofar as the book is focused on the right, it feels like this is... the audience is sort of a warning almost to the right.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. So there are a group of people, scholars, who are very attracted by the idea that the way liberals should respond to post-liberals is, in a certain sense, on their own terms. And say, okay, you want to talk about the good and the good life and so on, all right, we'll do that. So we'll become perfectionists as well. And... just historically speaking, it is true that until about the Cold War, most liberals were perfectionists and did have a strong commitment to some idea of the common good and so on. So sort of return to an earlier liberalism is the sort of the recommendation of people like Samuel Moyne, who might be some of you know, Yale historian, Alan Cahan, and so on. So they're saying, we need to return to perfectionist liberalism. Alexander Lefebvre from Sydney wrote a great book called Liberalism as a Way of Life, for example. So there are some people who are saying, the way forward here is to go back to perfectionist liberalism. And I can't, in a certain sense, make my mind up about this. One reason I think it's not the way forward is, if you said if Patrick Deneen was here, and you said, right, okay, liberals, we're going to drop neutrality now, and we're going to talk about the good life. Their point is that that's what we've been doing all along. And that doesn't change anything. I mean, Moyne thinks that somehow this will put us, rather than ships passing at night, would actually start to have a debate about these things. But from the post-liberals' point of view is that we've always thought you've been perfectionist. So it doesn't change anything if liberals make this shift. So there's one part of me which thinks this probably isn't the way to go. But I guess part of me does think, and I have no real basis for this, empirical or anything like this, part of me does think that liberalism has lost a lot of its radical spirit and its sort of motivational force and energy, precisely because it became wrapped up in procedures, neutrality, and those sorts of things, and stopped talking about questions of the good life, of character, the sort of things that completely obsessed 19th century liberals. And that this isn't going to convince any post-liberal or anyone of the new right, but in terms of maybe galvanising waverers or galvanising liberals to put up a better fight, maybe rediscovering the moral spirit of liberalism could be a way forward in doing that. Now, the penultimate chapter, which is the social liberal chapter, I talk about the social liberals and new liberals. So these were liberal thinkers at the turn of the Victorian age, really. T.H. Green, Hobson, Hobhouse, and they were the last great liberal perfectionists, in a sense. And they were hugely influential in terms of the Liberal Party at the turn of the century and the creation of the welfare state and so on. And they basically renewed liberalism at a time when The effects of industrialization have become clear. There was vast poverty in the cities, great inequality, and so on. Lots of people were saying, just like now, hey, this is the effect of liberalism. It shows we need something other than liberalism. And these thinkers were brilliant at basically rejuvenating ideologically liberalism, changing how we think about freedom, and so on. So when I say people like Moyne say we should go back to previous thinkers, these are sort of people they're thinking about, and they are brilliant. They are under recognised, I think, in the liberal canon, and I think you should teach them in your module. The trouble is, in my penultimate chapter, so I go back to them and say, well, let's look at these people then. And there's so much about their thought which just doesn't translate, or just can't survive life in the 21st century. They were incredibly optimistic about the power of the state, for example, whereas I think, ways that look sort of painfully naive now. And they were, very optimistic about progress and how science would inevitably lead to moral progress. And obviously that was punctured by the two, fatally punctured by the two wars. They had a very thick sort of metaphysics which links reason, virtue, and freedom, which I don't think makes sense to us today either. So there's a lot about perfection. As much as I might think a form of perfectionist liberalism might be what we need, I'm also very skeptical that it's available to us anymore, and that might be the great unravelling for liberalism, essentially, which is tragic and pessimistic.
Well, on that pessimistic, tragic bombshell, that's enough from me. I'd be really interested if I could open the floor for some questions from anyone here who's interested. Please raise your hand. And I will try, because I have the microphone which is being recorded, I'll try and summarise anything people want to say. Because I have many more excellent questions, but come on now. Don't make me quote Nick Timothy at Matt.
Yeah, go on, I want to know what Nick Timothy quote.
Let's give it up. Yeah, fantastic.
Kind of following on what you said at the end, and kind of reflecting back on sort of your fears around sort of the institutional Trojan horse methods that seem to be sort of being applied in America. Do you think that those two things kind of link in the sense that there's potentially quite a naive understanding or 20th century understanding of the state from this movement that doesn't quite fit in the sort of 21st century trajectory we have towards some sort of more networked, connected society, and therefore could they end up almost being at the vanguard of creating something that the opposite of what they want, either caught between the sort of the Musk view, which they couldn't ever reconcile because of sort of materialism that doesn't match sort of some of the confessional cosmology that they have, or a sort of communitarianist position that sort of emerges as if we move into a climate apocalypse, people think it has to be hyper-local but also networked without the ability of the state to enforce. I'm just interested sort of, do they place themselves within that, or is their state understanding the state quite naive?
Yes, I think it's...
Yeah, I cannot summarise that. It was an excellent question, though.
Oh,
please.
sorry.
No, please, Matt.
Yes, it is very naive. It's essentially Hobbesian account of the state, in which the executive is essentially sovereign, and if you get the executive power, you've got everything. Which I should say, Adrian Vermeule gets from Carl Schmitt, the infamous Nazi jurist. So before he became a post-liberal, he was a scholar, quite a sort of famous interpreter of Carl Schmitt. So he gets this from Carl Schmitt and runs with it, essentially. But it causes all sorts of problems for the theory. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, not least, just a really quite surely impossible problem of coordination. I mean, how do you get all these elites in the right positions, agreeing on the same ends? How do you get them coordinating, working together, timing it right, and so on? Given that they're all involved in these different networks, as you say, how on earth do you get that transition? He pays no attention to that whatsoever. It really is he just does imagine the state like a lever, and if you get your hand on that lever, you've won. it's silly. Yeah.
David?
So I have a question that follows on very well from that. It's kind of got two parts. The first part is, are there any examples of regimes that you can point to that the post-liberals in America would say that's kind of actually existing post-liberalism? Franco's Spain, Orban's Hungary, John Charles McQuaid's Ireland. Are there any examples where you can go, that is post-liberalism? And relatedly, related to the previous question, do you think there could be an actually existing post-liberalism? Let's say that they managed to get total control of the state and have all the levers. Is post-liberalism something you could do? Or would it simply collapse in on its own contradictions? Would it become something else?
Yeah.
If they had all the power, could they actually?
Yeah.
So, just for the record, the question was, do the post-liberals identify examples of post-liberalism, the ones they like, be it Hungary or Franco Spain, and then, regardless, or if that, can you actually imagine this being put into practice?
They're big fans of Orban, and they're forever going to meet him. And they have a Substack, or they had a Substack, called the Post-Liberal Order, which was full of pictures with them and the big man. And he pretended to be listening. Yeah, he's a small man, you're right, yeah. They always are, aren't they? I don't think it's right, though, actually. I mean, Hungary isn't a post-liberal state in a variety of different ways. Certainly is a Catholic post-liberal state. So, but nevertheless, in terms of someone... I mean, he's obviously described his project as illiberal democracy. So as someone who is committed to an illiberal form of politics, they're very appreciative. But also he talks all the time about returning Hungary to its Christian roots and reaffirming its Christian heritage and so on. Post-liberals are amenable to that as well. So that's probably the closest we have today. In truth, throughout history, the integralists would say that almost every Catholic state, sort of before the 20th century, was something like an integralist state. And that's what we should be, that they're the model, in a sense. Obviously, Orban's not an integralist, but those integralists are post-liberals just think history is abundant examples of this. Could it be possible? Yes, it could be possible. But I think for a variety of reasons I talk about in the book, it will only be possible with a great degree of coercion and violence. And I think Vermeulen recognises that. Vermeulen's a very cruel man. He's a highly intelligent man, but he has a genuinely wicked, cruel streak. And he talks at one point about searing with hot irons the liberal faith. And people have said, "Oh, that sounds like you're threatening violence." He goes, "Oh, no, I'm not. It's just a metaphor. It's just a metaphor." And then somewhere else they'll say, "Oh, yeah, those liberals are going to get it," and he revels in this teasing of the threat of violence and coercion that he thinks would be needed both to transition to a post-liberal state and probably to maintain the post-liberal state. So, in that sense, I think any sort of politics could be possible with enough coercion. The difference is that Vermeulen thinks it's we should enjoy the means and the ends in that sense. Whether it would work or sort of crumble under its own contradictions, that I don't know. And as I think has sort of been shown with liberalism in a certain sense, even if something fails, doesn't mean something comes up in its place. It can stumble on for a long time without falling. So I don't know about that, but I mean, I think these are people who are committed to a genuine transformative project, and would use the violence in order to achieve that.
Beautiful, fantastic.
So I was going to ask you, but I think that your answer to the last question answered it. How far would they go to tell us what their views are, their morals are? How far would they go to make that happen? I was trying to think, handmaid's tale, and
Yeah.
things like that. arguably, let's say it was the United States or something like that, was still a democracy because they would get voted out, wouldn't they? So what's their kind of view on, I mean, what do you see as the trajectory in terms of having this violence, but then having just be electoral corruption? What would that work?
They have a how do you put it? They're not particularly committed to the American Constitution. Let's put it that way. So on the one hand, sometimes they'll say, well, actually, there's not democracy in the American Constitution. It's all, it's all the colleges, and so actually, there's no reason why we should be as committed to democracy as it is in its current form. But really, you have to understand, I think, with the post-liberals, that they think America is a mistake. The American experiment was a liberal experiment. The American Constitution was a liberal constitution. And that it has failed, they think, shows that the American experiment has failed. Politically, this puts them, Americans, I know to tell you this, are very patriotic. It's very unusual to have anyone involved in American politics who would be anti-American. But they are sort of really quite passionately anti-American, and they make little attempt to show that this is in tune with the American way of life or anything like that. And they'll often talk about needing something like a second founding moment or something like that, in which it is not clear democracy would feature particularly heavily or at all. Again, I mean, it slightly depends on who you're talking to. Deneen does think naively that if only the Republican Party was post-liberal, that it would do well electorally. Vermeulen doesn't think that, and he thinks we're just too corrupted by liberalism. So don't ask us what's good for us. We're the last people to ask. You should ask post-liberals. So that part of the post-liberal spectrum is going to be very anti-democratic indeed. At least, I guess, until maybe we have the right values and we can be trusted to make the right choices.
Okay, how do you see post-liberalism treating capitalism on the right and on the left?
Yeah, good question. I think another critique you might make of post-liberalism is it's not radical enough economically. They don't have an alternative political economy. They don't offer a non-capitalist, political model at all. So how on earth all the things that Di read out will actually be possible in this model is never really explained. So I have no answer to you on this, other than I think it's a real weakness of post-liberalism. But I actually think it's a weakness of almost every alternative politics at the moment. That it seems to me that that almost every alternative is lacking a political economy, a viable alternative model of a political economy. How on earth do you get growth and, you've got zero productivity, high levels of debt, so on and so forth. Our problems are really quite unique, I think, and no one's got an answer to that. And my own personal view is probably the movement, or hopefully I should say maybe, the movement's going to do the best in the next few years is going to be that which has the alternative, or has a better view of how we move forward with our political economy. And I don't mean that in terms of rejecting capitalism or anything like that, but I just think that certainly on the new right, post-liberals are not unique in lacking a political economy. And I think it's also true of things like Blue Labour as well. So sorry, that's not really an answer other than say I think you've just identified where they need to say a lot more.
Stepping away from the economics element, if we remove that sort of left on economics critique, how distinct is post-liberalism from national conservatism?
Yeah. And
I will now quote you, Nick Timothy, because I promised you. I was thinking about this, the right in the UK. You mentioned Kemi Badenoch later on in the text, and you point out she's referred to herself as a liberal. You do include Nick Timothy as one of the people in here. And there were two quotes this month which stuck out to me when I was thinking about this idea of shall we say, post-liberalism which is willing to argue for a moral common good linked into sort of a Christian heritage potentially against liberal pluralism. We had Nick Timothy, of course, on the 21st attacking mass prayer at Ramadan, saying it was, quote, an act of domination straight from the Islamist playbook. And Kemi Badenoch, about a week before, had said, quote, the leader of the opposition, in towns and cities across Britain, there are large blocks of voters whose political loyalties are swayed by conflicts in the Middle East, not the British national interest. Separatism is most visible in some Muslim communities, with Islamist extremism its most violent expression. And these are not politically neutral these are what David Cameron referred to as muscular liberalism, potentially. What stops a Kemi or a Nick from being a post-liberal?
Well, as opposed to a national conservative. Or liberal.
I don't think I'm calling them liberals.
Okay. So I think so in the book I do talk about the difference between national conservatives and post-liberals, and I think there are an important set of differences. I think the most important is that for post-liberals we need to return to a politics of informed by Catholicism because Catholicism is true, right? And that is what ends up or leads post-liberalism to end up being deeply anti-American and deeply critical. They're not conservative in a small c sense. They are radical, right? I think actually in a certain sense you can say post-liberals aren't conservative. They don't want to conserve much in America. They want to completely upend it. National conservatives want to preserve Christianity and want to have a politics grounded in a Christian version of the common good because they think that's our heritage and because they think it's our culture. Not, at least not primarily, because they think it's true. Now, to evidence that, the leading thinker of national conservatives is a Israeli scholar called Yoram Hazony. And he is Jewish, as you would expect. But he is the main proponent arguing that Western countries need to return to their Christian roots. He won't obviously think that's because those roots are true. It's because they are their roots, and that's what creates social solidarity, and so therefore Islam is a threat to that social solidarity. It's a threat to the American or the British way of life, and so on. Post-liberals, you'll never hear post-liberals talking about the American or the British way of life. They don't really care about the American or British way of life. In fact, Vermeulen at one point says his sort of answer to immigration. He's like, he says, I think immigration's a great idea, he said, but the people who should get top of the list should be Catholics. There are any Catholics in. No matter where they're from, get Catholics in, right? And he doesn't care what that does to the American way of life. All that matters, again, is that Catholicism is true. So I think that's what, when Kemi and Nick are talking about the domination of public sphere and that sort of stuff, and Danny Kruger talks about things like this a lot as well. For me, they are national conservatives and not post-liberals.
Fantastic. I think we have literally 2 minutes left. Is there a final thing which you think Matt can give a pithy summary to? Seriously, Dave? Okay. Pithy summary for final Jerry Strabinger, final thought. Ooh.
Do you know what? Part of it with Deneen is probably a completely personal story in which he didn't get on at, Princeton. They didn't give him a job, and Georgetown didn't give him a job, and he's full of resentment for this. And this resentment that he doesn't think he got the job that he deserves means he's lashed out at liberalism. I think that's the answer. Vermeulen, I genuinely think there's deep-seated hatred, passionate hatred that's come on. He's a convert to Catholicism, and I think that matters as well. But God, no, I don't know. I guess is the answer. Who does know? Yeah.
Fantastic. No, before we say thank you to Matt, I just wanted to say we also have 2 further IPR events coming up soon. On the 30th of April, Liam Byrne is coming to discuss why populists are winning and how to beat them. And then on the 5th of May, Professor Glenn O'Hara will be coming to talk about his new book on the Blair administration and how the Blair government reshaped the country. So if you're interested in those topics, look to the IPR website. But with much more important at this point, can we all say thank you to Matt for that really interesting conversation?
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate that.
Thank you.